Welcome to session 2, where our theme is the Gordon Commission's perspective, moving towards assessment for learning. My name is Ernest Morrell. I am a professor of English education and director of the Institute for Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. It gives me great pleasure to chair this panel of distinguished scholars from the Gordon Commission who are speaking toward what, in the opinion of many, is one of the most important educational questions of our time, and that is the future of education assessment. As the president of a 35,000-member organization, the National Council of Teachers of English, in our surveys of members, it is their #1 concern, and that is what are we going to do with the future of assessment. In my brief remarks, I would like to frame the scope of the Gordon Commission's work, identify several of the key participants, and discuss some of its many accomplishments to date. I will then turn to my colleagues, Professors Robert Mislevy, James Pellegrino, Herve Varenne, and Ed Gordon, who will each present for 12 to 15 minutes. At that point, we will use our remaining time in an open discussion where we would welcome your comments and questions. So a little bit on the background of the Gordon Commission on the future of assessment in education. Led by Dr. Edmund W. Gordon, an endowed emeritus professor at Yale and Columbia Universities and the founder of the Institute for Urban and Minority Education, the Gordon Commission on the future of assessment in education brings together leading scholars to consider what educational assessment will look like and what it should be capable of doing now and through the middle of the 21st century. The Commission's authors are distinguished scholars in the fields of education sciences, psychometrics, and public policy, and are thoughtful leaders in the arena of public affairs. Several are also deans at leading colleges of education across the country. Some of the members of the Commission include Eva Baker, Linda Darling-Hammond, James Paul G., Louis Gomez, Kenji Hakuda, Robert Mislevy, James Pellegrino, Lauren Resnick, Lori Shepard, Lee Scholman, Claude Still, Herve Varenne, and many, many more. During year 1 of the Commission, they explored what education is expected to become and should be by 2050. What will be the consequent demands on the educational assessment enterprise, and what technical and theoretical solutions to those demands are conceivable. During year 2, the Commission turned its attention to the development of specifications for procedures, instrumentation, data management systems, and administrative policies and practices that are appropriate to the identified changing demands, as well as the development of policy positions that are responsive to those demands. This past March, at the release of its public policy and technical reports, the Commission's authors called on states to develop systems of assessment that go beyond identifying student achievement for accountability purposes and instead improve classroom instruction and provide greater insight into how children learn. This is a quote: "Our conviction is that while the field of measurement in education has established a splendid history primarily directed at the measurement of education, the future of assessment in education will depend on the field's capacity to pursue assessment for education." And that is a quote from Ed Gordon at that Commission's meeting last spring. More recently, the Commission has held public hearings and symposia at the annual meetings of the American Educational Research Association, the National Academy of Education, as well as universities across the country, such as UCLA, the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, George Washington University, and Rockland College. Professor Gordon asked me to speak a little bit about the Commission's fellows and the work that they did since they're not able to be here. Complementing the work of the Commission's authors is the work of the Gordon Commission Fellows. The Gordon Fellows are a dynamic group of 6 emerging pre- and postdoctoral scholars in the fields of learning sciences, anthropology, psychometrics, the sociology of education, and education technology. These fellows were assembled to analyze and identify emergent themes, critical innovations, similarities, and distinctions, and ultimately synthesize the knowledge produced across the body of commissioned papers in brief papers of their own. It was Dr. Gordon's opinion that the work of the Commission's experienced authors should be complemented by a younger generation of scholars who, in their ongoing dialogue with him and their syntheses of the more than 24 papers, would add new life and new ideas to the project. During their work together over the spring and summer of 2012, each fellow selected overlapping cross-sections of the papers to critically analyze and present for a series of fellows' lead group discussions of each paper, all under the tutelage of Commission Chairman Dr. Edmund Gordon and myself. The meetings of the fellows alternated throughout the spring and summer months between the Institute for Urban and Minority Education, at that time in Harlem, and the Segis Institute, a cultural, educational, and research foundation dedicated to improving the educational and social conditions for all disenfranchised people, which is located in Pomona, New York, right next to the home of one Edmund Gordon. In addition to Drs. Gordon and Morell, the fellows' meetings were facilitated by Executive Officer of the Commission, Ms. Paula Henke, and attended by project consultants and the UME Assistant Director, Veronica Hawley. These fellows' meetings provided a platform for the 6 emergent scholars to put the papers into conversation with one another, with their peers, and with their mentors to create a rich, dynamic analysis. The fellows' meetings culminated in the production of 6 synthesis papers authored by the fellows, providing their analyses, recommendations, major findings, and perceived implications for practice and instrumentation development policy. All of the synthesis papers are available at the website www.gordoncommission.org. So I wanted to provide that framing so you can understand a little bit of the scope of this project. We'll have 4 papers presented today and the discussion by Dr. Gordon, but really this is a work in progress that has evolved with the help of the Educational Testing Service over half a decade, involved several dozen senior scholars as well as a half a dozen junior scholars. Policy and technical reports have been produced and disseminated this year. There's been a series of public events, and this is just the next phase in many, but I wanted to give you some sense of what these authors here today represent. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the panel. What I'll do is I'll introduce each speaker before they come up and give you the title of their talk. So the first presenter will be Dr. Robert Mislevy. Dr. Mislevy is the Frederick M. Lord Chair in Measurement and Statistics at ETS. He was previously Professor of Measurement and Statistics at the University of Maryland and Affiliate Professor of Survey Methods and of Secondary Language Acquisition. His research applies developments in technology, statistics, and cognitive science to practical problems in assessment. He developed the plausible values methodology for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, helped Cisco Systems develop simulation-based assessments of network engineering, and with Linda Steinberg and Russell Allman, created an evidence-centered assessment design framework. Professor Mislevy's publications include Automated Scoring of Complex Tasks and Computer-Based Testing, and the chapter Cognitive Psychology in Educational Measurement. He has received Career Contributions Awards from AERI and NCME, and 3x won NCME's Award for Technical Contributions to Measurement. He's a past president of the Psychometrics Society and a member of the National Academy of Education. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mislevy.
Well, my title here is from science fiction author William Gibson, and I chose it because I think the future of assessment is already here, just isn't very evenly distributed, and I think the same is true of psychometrics as well. So I'll talk a little bit about 2 examples and then see where that leads to implications for psychometrics. There are actually lots of different examples I could have chosen, but the 2 that I picked, I got this idea driving down the road past the high school where my daughters went to high school. From the outside, it looks pretty much the same as it did when it was built. Oh, I could do this too. Okay, or I could do both. Get some feedback going. The high school looks pretty much the same as it did from the outside, and I suppose in many of the rooms inside, things were happening pretty much the same as they were 45 years ago. But because I worked on some of the projects, I happen to know that in at least 2 of the rooms in that school, something really different was going on, something that has to do with learning, and assessment was right at the center of it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I also learned the trick is you point this up here. It's nice to be in the second session. The first one is AP Studio Art Portfolio Assessment. So if you know anything about AP Studio Art, you know that most of the AP Studio or AP assessments are sort of like an assessment at the end of the year. AP Studio Art Portfolios is not like that. During the whole course of the year, students are working on a series of pieces. They have challenges that they, in collaboration with their teachers, are defining their own challenges and tackling them. There are certain requirements that the work that they do locally in their classroom, which is used for their grades, is also going to be rateable at the end of the year centrally at, well, it used to be in New Jersey, now it's mostly online. But there's a framework of meaning for evaluating those so that the work that they did locally can be assigned ratings that can be used by the schools, by colleges to which they would want to go, as feedback to the students and to the teachers themselves. One of my favorite parts in AP Studio Art is the one called concentration, where the student is choosing their own challenge that they're going to develop over the course of the year. Two that, for example, the year that I worked with them, with Carol Myford, one was interesting idea of angularity in wheel-thrown pottery, which two things don't usually go together. Another was a series of work that begins with representational interpretations, evolves into abstraction. Here's a slide of one of the pieces from Angularity. Now, Psychometrics was involved in that, in modeling these ratings at the end of the year, multiple ratings for multiple sections of every portfolio. What it definitely was not is like trying to measure some trait, some artistic skill. What it was trying to do is to summarize in this shared framework across schools, across hundreds of schools, is the students' unique accomplishments in this shared framework of understanding. And that's the key learning goal, being able to think like, understand the materials, understand how to use different techniques, become more familiar with styles, with genres, and actually put them to work with your own hands. So the psychometrics, which is a form of generalizability theory, help characterize, design, monitor the consistency and the variation, the weight of evidence. A very important thing was in these central ratings, we have literally hundreds of thousands of pieces and bits of information, ratings, judges across students, sections, and so on. So just being able to get some scan across all of that information, and particularly looking for unusual patterns. Things like, oh, here's a portfolio, has 7 ratings, some very high, some very low. What's going on here? So the limited resources could focus on where interesting things were going on. Sometimes it was problems. Sometimes it was things the program had to learn, like new media or new styles. That framework, those evaluations, also gave feedback to individuals while they're working in their classroom, to the classroom teachers, and to the system level as well. So here's the important thing about psychometrics. In this shared framework of understanding, the psychometric models were used to characterize evidence, to help share information, develop values, look for problems, help the system evolve. Other example, another room in Lawrence Township High School was a local Cisco Networking Academy class. Now the Cisco Networking Academy, I don't know if you know much about those, but they're in the local community college, high school, maybe YMCA, are these classes where students learn about beginning network engineering. Cisco itself doesn't run these things. The Networking Academy, what they do is they provide over the internet things like curriculum, instructional materials, assessment resources. And so those are used locally. Now, I started working with Cisco a little more than 10 years ago now when the program was taken over relatively early in its history by John Behrens. And one of the first things John did was talk with a lot of stakeholders. What do they think about the program? Turns out people who are teachers, people who hired beginning network engineers, students themselves, they were pretty happy with the curriculum and the curriculum materials, but they hated the assessments. And that's because, well, all the assessments were pretty much multiple choice, and every question was basically a linguistic transformation of some sentence in instructional materials. So you take some kid, get really good at answering those questions, but put them in front of a busted network, they had no idea what to do. Or to work with a client. Here are the client's needs, their considerations. No idea what to do. So John, Dennis Frezzo realized what they needed is a lot more experience doing, thinking about how you actually put this knowledge to work. Being a network engineer isn't knowing a bunch of stuff, it's knowing how you interact with systems, with clients. So that's the part that I worked on with them in developing this cohesive view for what it is that you would like these students to come to know. What do they need to do in the classrooms to learn about it? What do you need to do in assessments to get some feedback for them, for potential employers, for teachers, to see how they're coming along? So we worked on a small pilot project called NetPass for simulation-based network troubleshooting and design that led to what is now in wide use a program called Packet Tracer, where the learning, actually doing troubleshooting in part of the curriculum. The assessments, they have a layer of games over the top of them now. I'll just mention here that one of the favorite games, especially in high schools, is that there is the internet gateway device. There are two teams, and there are like 4 devices, routers and switches in between, and here's your PC, here's the PC of the other team. Every one of those devices has something wrong with it, so you're trying to troubleshoot that. And if you get to the network gateway, you change the security code and you lock the other team out. And that's a lot of fun. But to do it, you actually have to know something about troubleshooting network systems. So this is a little bit about what that game looks like. And it looks a lot like SimCity. And you can see what you're doing here is that it's a simulation environment, and you can use this whether you're in Lawrence Township High School or in the middle of Uganda. And there's one PC that everybody has to use. But it gives you the experiences of network shooting. And so this is a way that design and assessment and the psychometrics for capturing, making sense of that information is being put to use here. Okay, let's see. So point here again too is that there is psychometrics going on to make this happen, to make it work well, to ground feedback to students, to make it so that instructors can create their own tasks for their own students to work on what they need to. In other words, utilizing, like they do in AP Studio Art, utilizing the local knowledge in conjunction with this larger framework, and the psychometrics is assisting them in doing this. So again, what we have is psychometrics working with this coherent view of learning to characterize evidence as it plays out in the situations under the constraints for the purposes of this program. Okay, so what does that mean about psychometrics? Well, psychometrics started evolving as an inextricable mix of psychology, inferential reasoning, statistics, particular uses. Over the years, and I thank Bob Brennan and Neil Kingston for allowing me to do this in 20 seconds rather than 20 minutes, is that increased understanding has helped deconstruct, to pull apart that mix, to understand, well, what are some of the inferential problems that statistics will help us tackle? The psychology here. Well, it's good to know how to model the learning of cats. We also can extend that with learning how students learn to troubleshoot computer networks. We can draw on information processing, sociocognitive or situative views of learning as well. Some of the models that we use were developed under trait and behavioral psychology, but the models don't know that. They're about looking for patterns and using them in appropriate ways, and they can be applied in a far greater range for purposes under different psychological frames. So again, what we're about is understanding forms of evidence, how to reason from those, how to set up situations that help us get the information that is actually useful for feedback on learning at whatever level is at issue. Psychometrics is some science, but I would say it's mostly client-driven. There are, well, let's see, this symposium and others, you'll hear some stories where psychometricians are among the bad guys in the story. I've given some examples where I think psychometricians are among the good guys. Which are they? Well, it's complicated. It's really some of both. We have mortgages and electrical bills to pay for as well. So in projects where I've seen the biggest changes at the margins, like AP Studio Art and Cisco Networking Academy, and others like the National Board of Medical Examiners standardized patient problems, defense community. I worked on another one troubleshooting hydraulics in F-15s, community colleges, assessing 1% students. These are all venues where thinking from the ground up about what's important to learn, how you know it when you see it, what conditions that it's learned in, what people actually have to do, what kind of assessment goes along with that, that work has started. Usually very small. Sometimes, like AP Studio Art, Cisco Networking, you end up with millions of students doing that. But it's been at the margins, not through what you might call the big educational machine. And in those projects, psychometricians are among members of the necessarily interdisciplinary teams that make these advances. So I would claim here the future is already here, just not evenly distributed. I'd say this is true of psychometricians and testing companies too. And it's not just different psychometricians are different ones. We all seem to be some sort of mix. I work on some projects that you would hate very much, trying to help them do a better job, and others that you would love very much, trying to help them do a better job. And for different ones of you, the ones that you would hate and the assessments you would love are different ones, but all of them can benefit by principled reasoning. So psychometricians, we have concepts and tools to help address practical problems in new forms, conceptions of assessment. In fact, we're already working on a number of these projects, usually in the margins. Much of what we work on is projects that are cast in the frameworks, the psychological and learning frameworks for the purposes and the constraints of the clients that we work with. But I'd say that psychometricians as individuals, psychometrics as a profession, testing companies, can adapt to new kinds of assessment very quickly. The reason is because those mortgage bills just keep right on coming. We can do that fast or we can do it slow, but it depends an awful lot on what people want. And I think, as my bottom line, it's those projects at the margins is where we help contribute most to what it is that they are going to want. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. James Pellegrino. James W. Pellegrino is Liberal Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor and Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He also serves as co-director of UIC's Interdisciplinary Learning Sciences Research Institute. His research and development interests focus on children's and adults' thinking and learning and the implications of cognitive research and theory for assessment and instructional practice. He has published over 275 books, chapters, and articles in the areas of cognition, instruction, and assessment. His current research is funded by the National Science Foundation and the Institute of Education Sciences. He has served as head of several National Academy of Sciences study committees, including co-chair of the Committee on the Foundations of Assessment and co-chair of the Committee on Deeper Learning and 21st Century Skills. He currently co-chairs the Committee on Developing Assessments of Science Proficiency in K-12. He's a lifetime member of the National Academy of Education and currently serves on the technical advisory committees of the Smarter Balance, PARC, DLM, and NC-SC consortia of states funded under the U.S. Department of Education's Race to the Top Assessment Initiative. The title of Dr. Pellegrino's talk is Connecting Cognitive Science and Measurement Science, an argument regarding necessity and sufficiency.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here and to be on this panel and to be part of this wonderful symposium on testing and looking back and looking forward to the future, and also to be part of this celebration for Teachers College and its historic contributions to psychology and education. Bob's a psychometrician, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and we've learned to talk to each other. Actually, we've learned to collaborate, I think, pretty well, which is a part of, I think, a common theme we're both going to be stressing today. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. So what I want to do today is actually try to connect together a variety of things, and including starting with the Gordon Commission and then ending with the Gordon Commission. But in between, I want to make an argument about the importance of connecting cognitive science and measurement science, and a little bit about sort of the history, but also why I think we're in a good position now to move forward. So there's really 4 parts of the argument I'm going to go through fairly quickly given time. And the first is about the Gordon Commission. and the point I want to make is, for those of you who haven't seen it and seen the 2 reports, the Gordon Commission vision for the future of assessment is both very bold, and I think it's very appropriate and very much needed at this moment in time for a variety of reasons, given the complexity of the landscape. And I know Ed's going to be talking about this later, but at the core of the Gordon Commission work is this idea that assessment should have this function of improving and reforming teaching and learning through better assessments. And if you read the various documents and reports from the Gordon Commission, you see that there are a set of questions and a key set of issues, one of which is this idea of why, how, and what we assess. It's very hard. I got small print up here, and so I'm going to do this. Is this working? Yeah, I'm going to do it from here so I can see. So one of these is an argument about what we must reconsider, why, what, and how we assess. And you've heard some of that in the earlier panel. A second is that this idea that assessments must support teaching and learning and human development, and why there's a need for change, and what that means, and I'm sure Ed will elaborate on that later. And also that improvement of assessments is not a simple matter. It requires various actors to be involved, including actions at the state, the federal, and the national levels. It includes support for some very fundamental and important research and development. Now, I can't go into the arguments of this, but the point I want to make is that the Gordon Commission has essentially set up an agenda, a picture about the issues we need to face with respect to assessment and its fundamental role in improving teaching and learning. The second part of my argument is that attaining that vision really is going to require us to put together the pieces that actually we have needed to put together for a long time. That is cognitive science and measurement science. And now I want to argue this is not a new issue. So in the words of Yogi Berra, that famed New Yorker or New York, New Jersey Yankee, basically this is deja vu all over again. And what do I mean by that? Well, we already heard today about the history of E.L. Thorndike. There was a moment in time in the early part of the evolution of psychology where the psychology of learning and the psychology of measurement and testing were one and the same, or at least they were tightly connected. And in the work of Thorndike, we had the principles of scientific psychology, theories of learning, subject matter learning, the psychology of learning arithmetic, for those of you who don't remember that, and also mental tests and measurements and intelligence. But somewhere over the first half of the 20th century, the fields of research on learning and teaching diverged from the fields of assessment, so much so that in 1957, Lee J. Cronbach wrote what was a really seminal piece in his presidential address to the American Psychological Association on the two disciplines of psychology. And he framed the two disciplines problem in terms of the fact that what he described was the features of the two disciplines of scientific psychology and the benefits of what he was calling for then the reunification. It was the psychology of learning that was coming from the laboratory, from experimental psychology, and all the developments that had ensued, and we heard some of the history about that with respect to tests, measurements, and differential psychology. And he actually called for linking theories of learning and research on learning and instruction with the tradition of assessing individual differences in cognitive abilities. And he went so far as to make some overly optimistic predictions. This is one of them. Such findings, when replicated and explained, will carry us into an educational psychology which measures readiness for different types of teaching and which invents teaching methods for different types of readiness. And constructs originating in differential psychology are now being tied to experimental variables. As a result, the whole theoretical picture in such an area as human abilities is changing. Now, what we know is while he had that vision of bringing these together, there were some problems. And much of this vision took the form of trying to pursue aptitude treatment interactions. And one of the things that we learned was that his vision was correct, but the psychology on which he was trying to base this was inadequate to do the job. And in fact, in the 70s, when he wrote his Two Disciplines Revisited article, again for APA, he talked about some of the fundamental issues. But one of the big issues that emerged was that the psychology of learning that existed at the time Cronbach wrote this and the emergence of cognitive psychology were not one and the same. Cognitive psychology as a field which moved us away from associative kinds of views of learning, which had been developed in the early part of the 20th century, were inadequate to actually frame the nature of subject matter learning and cognition and complex cognition. And so over the decades, starting in the 70s to the 90s, the field of cognitive psychology emerged, and I was privileged to have my first position at the University of Pittsburgh at the Learning Research and Development Center and to work with another visionary and pioneer, Robert Glaser. And Bob wrote this quote in 1991 in which he talked about what was happening in cognitive psychology and its potential to dramatically change the nature of what we assess and the development of assessments. He was on the mark with respect to the vision, but again, the psychology was not quite there yet because what we had evolved in cognitive psychology was a view that had to do with being able to figure out performance, but we really hadn't thought a lot about learning yet. We hadn't come back to learning yet. And slowly we got there. The other thing was measurement had not fully evolved in ways that had begun to grapple with the complexity of the cognitive models that we were talking about. So that vision, and I think what Bob wrote there, is actually more attainable today. So that is the third part of my argument, that we're better poised now to meet the challenges than was previously the case. And of course, it's always easy. Hindsight is always 20/20. It's very easy to sort of see where we went awry, but now sort of why are we in a better position? Well, as we approach the new millennium, the National Research Council, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Foundation brought together a panel on which Bob Mislevy served, and I had the privilege of co-chairing it with Bob Glazer, to ask some fundamental questions, which was essentially, what have we learned about the psychology of cognition and learning? What have we learned about measurement science? And what have we learned in the area of technology that might allow us to develop a new approach, a new way to think about assessment? And so my argument is that one of the things that we now realize, and I think this is also reflected in the remarks that Bob made, is that we need to understand assessment as fundamentally a process of evidentiary reasoning, reasoning from evidence. It's a very principled process, and in the volume Knowing What Students Know, which was the product of that research committee, we made an argument that basically there were three fundamental elements that describe this this process of reasoning from evidence, what we call the assessment triangle. One of my favorite remarks is that NSF funded the National Research Council probably to the tune of several $1 million to fund this study committee to meet for 3 years, and the best we could come up with was a triangle. On the other hand, it's a very important triangle, and the argument we made is that essentially assessment has to begin with with cognition. That is, your theories, your models, your data about how students represent knowledge and develop competence in a domain. The way you conceptualize what it means to know, absolutely critical, because that conceptualization drives your design of tasks or situations that will allow you to observe students' performance. We can't ever really know what a student knows. We don't have a physical measurement. We don't have a dipstick where we can stick it in one ear and pull it out and say, Jim's down a quart. We don't have that kind of, so we're making inferences. And those inferences are based on things we ask students to say, do, write, whatever. And so the nature of those tasks has to be driven in terms of the kinds of evidence we want about what we value with respect to what's important in our theories and models of learning. And of course, we have to have a way to make sense of the data. We have to interpret it and connect it all together. And for assessment to really work, it has to be an integration, a coordination of those three things. Because in fact, as the measurement folks would tell us, that the hard part is essentially how do we take that evidence? How do we assemble it into an argument for which we can make certain claims about its reliability, its generalizability, its validity? So in essence, the argument that we made was that the foundations of assessment rest on two things. Essentially, what goes into the cognition vertex, advances in the sciences of thinking and learning, which informs us about what observations are important and sensible to make, and advances in the measurement and statistical sciences, which have to do with the interpretation vertex. That is, how do we make sense of that evidence in ways that allow us to communicate it with respect to probability, likelihood, the inferences and the conclusions that we can draw with a certain degree of confidence. Now, those contributions over the last 20, 30 years have been immense. So I'm just going to point out the fact that many of the contributions about what we know about how people learn have been captured in reports from the National Research Council, how people learn and how students learn. And notice the shift from just general points of view about how people learn to disciplinary-based learning. And the Teachers College, again, has been at the forefront in this work by essentially helping us move this further forward in thinking about theories and evidence about learning trajectories in mathematics and in science, and what they imply for curriculum, instruction, assessment, and for policy. So many of the developments have begun to be captured in these reports, and they give us a much richer conception about the nature of student cognition and student learning that can serve as a foundation for thinking about assessment. At the same time, there have been significant advances in measurement and evidentiary reasoning. I list some of them here, and I should point out that several people in this room are responsible for some of those advances. And the point is that this is one that actually Bob Mislevy got us to understand. So when we first convened the Foundations of Assessment Committee, we had 16 people. Then there were 3 psychometricians on the committee, and they were significantly outnumbered. And we went around the room on the first meeting, and everybody was asked, well, what do you think the issues are? Or what's the problem? And almost to a person, it was the psychometricians. It's their fault, okay? And we had 3 resolute psychometricians, Bob, Mark Wilson, and Kadria Erican, and they convinced us that, no, they're not the problem, that many of us are the problem, because we haven't articulated our theories in ways that allow us to connect up with the more sophisticated ways of thinking in terms of evidentiary reasoning and modeling, and that this was a two-way street, or in some ways what Bob said, it was the client problem, okay? We weren't asking the right questions and we weren't framing this. So the point is that there are much more sophisticated ways to model, and that we have advances to make in bringing them together. The point I want to make is that connecting learning theory and measurement theory is not a simple thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. It requires an ongoing dialogue and interaction. For one thing, many of the more sophisticated methods we have that are available have yet to be made fully usable and understandable, particularly to a large part of the community. I'll be done in just a couple of minutes. At a conceptual level, one of the challenges is to figure out ways to how we fit particular kinds of statistical and evidentiary models to certain kinds of data, because it varies depending upon the time scale of the learning we're talking about, the grain size, and the intended purpose and uses, the inferences we wish to make. So as Bob said earlier, in order for this to work, you have to have a dialogue and a collaboration between educators, curriculum people, psychometricians, and learning scientists. And this is a sustained dialogue. It is not, as Bob would oftentimes say, is somebody develops an instrument and they throw it over the transom to the psychometricians and say, go scale it. That's not what the kind of collaboration we're talking about. So my last point is that the time is now to shape the future of educational assessment. And why do I say that? Well, for one thing, we have new standards. And these standards do a pretty decent job of trying to draw upon what we have learned about the nature of mathematics learning and the nature of science learning and teaching, and have tried to incorporate that into more principled ways to reflect that in standards documents. Of course, one of the things it still needs to do is to be translated into curriculum and instructional methods, and we've sort of put the cart before the horse by starting with the tests. But given that, I'm going to go back to the Gordon Commission, and 2 quotes from that. One is the point that we tried to make in the Gordon Commission, that to be helpful in achieving the learning goals, which are really significant in the Common Core and in the next generation science standards, assessments must fully represent the competencies that the increasingly complex and changing world demands. And so to do so, the tasks and activities in the assessments must be models worthy of the attention and energy of teachers and students. We have to get real performances, not just surrogates for that, and that has consequences and challenges. And the last point is that it's important that assessments do more than document what students are capable of and what they know, to be as useful as possible, and I'm sure Ed will elaborate on this. Assessments should provide clues as to why students think the way they do and how they're learning, as well as the reasons for their misunderstandings. So thank you again for inviting me, and Ed, thank you for inviting me to be part of the Gordon Commission.
I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Herve Varenne. Dr. Varenne is a professor of education in the programs in anthropology and education and applied anthropology in the Department of International and Transcultural Studies here at Teachers College, Columbia University. His scholarly interests include culture, communication, and education with special attention to comparative and historical conditions. While chair of the department from 2001 to 2006, he guest edited a special issue of Teachers College Record entitled Alternative Anthropological Perspectives on Education. He has been co-director with Edmund W. Gordon of a study group on comprehensive education and co-edited, in collaboration with Dr. Linda Lin, 2 more volumes including Theoretical Perspectives on Comprehensive Education, The Way Forward, and Educating Comprehensively, Varieties of Educational Experience. Dr. Varenne's talk today will be entitled An Anthropologist's Perspective on Everyday Assessments and Their Relevance to Formal Assessments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Varenne.
Anthropologists love origin myths. As Malinowski once said, such myths provide a charter for social life. That is, they provide the justification for the ensuing constitutive texts that make a new world for all concerned. That is, and I now move far from the usual theories of myth, a myth is also a statement in a conversation that started before the myth was adopted in what Lévi-Strauss once called the collective mode. It's a conversation which in this myth had at least 100 years or 2,000 years, depending on how you want to start the history of this statement. A myth, in that sense, is also an assessment of the past and the beginning of further conversations that may be all the longer that the myth is more powerful and charters a social life for larger populations. These conversations about the social order is what I have called in other places collective deliberations. It is famous that the texts that first constituted America do not say much about education. But soon, in Massachusetts and elsewhere in the United States, people deliberated about public schools and everything they entailed. I particularly like this report by Horace Mann because it's all about taxation and the importance of taxing people whose children are not going to school. And of course, taxation, architecture. I was going to put a picture of a yellow school bus since Teachers College was involved in making all school buses yellow. And of course, curriculum and pedagogy. Thanks to the papers from earlier this morning, I know more today about the people who started the next conversations about the assessments of individual learning in school. And this was more or less at the same time as school buses were made yellow. School psychology and testing and measurement, and thanks to Yale Thorndike and many others, the conversation moved. But the concern with assessing individuals is arguably here in the origin myth themselves. For if people are created equal, how should the powers that wrote the myths and keep them alive deal with inequality? How should the people, the powers that be, who control the populations for which they claim responsibility, how are they going to control this? And I claim that this is a political problem and not simply a policy problem. So the conference today is another occasion to participate. Okay, sorry. Thank you. Ed is always very good at instructing me at what I'm doing wrong, and always doing it very gently and very nicely in ways that I completely accept. So the conference today obviously is another occasion to participate in the continuing deliberations about how to expand our major origin myth into reformed institutions. I want to do so by exploring these deliberations as precisely conversations, during which we make utterances, papers like now, that assess older utterances, whether texts, declarations, regulations, papers, and books by other intellectuals, by taking them into account, even as we seek to move the deliberations in new directions. So for me to do so in this context, I need to take you back briefly to charter texts in my discipline, or at least in the discipline as I practice it, and most anthropologists, I'm a very odd form of anthropologist. But anyway, in this world of mine, the word assessment may have first appeared in a paper by Harvey Sachs, in which, building on Goffman and Garfinkel, he discussed what is involved in everyday life at the moment when it happened fully synchronous, in a synchronous fashion, how do we decide what to do about people that we meet for the first time, given our professional responsibilities? How are we going to make them fit into our own life? What methods do we use to figure out who a person is? What is this person doing? What is this person doing in the future? And what we should do about it, if anything? And all on the basis of a display by this person that is now public. And you cannot wait 6 months to get a test. You have to do it now. Asking such questions led to a powerful recasting of much research by anthropologists asking questions about what happens in schools and their classrooms as adults and children meet and interact routinely within highly constrained environment. This is a page from one of the first of these studies that were made based on ethnomethodology, conversational analysis in a classroom by Bud Meehan. And in some ways, it formalized the obvious in the everyday life of a classroom. Much of schooling is about answering questions to which the questioner already knows the answer. Because the point is assessing whether the student knows something. The first thing you should learn in school is do not question whether the questioner really knows the answer. The important thing here is that you have 3 moves, and that the third move in the sequence, question, answer, assessment, is the move that determines whether this sequence is about school or about something else. When I teach this, we use the what time is it question, what time is it at 6 o'clock. On Broadway, you say, thank you. And you don't say, oh, good, you know how to read time. And so on and so forth. And we have a whole collection of them, including a cop. It's my watch, man. So the theme that to which I will return is the significance of the present in the future, in what somebody is going to say next. Given this form of research, given all this, new forms of research could be pursued, including the assessment by students of their teachers' performance. That is, we have already talked about teachers' assessment of the students. Here now is an instance of 4 students assessing a teacher. The teacher is doing something that at that point was apparently famous, scripted pedagogy, which involves a lot of these kind of movements. And the students have been watching that for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then one student says that. Okay, that's le bras d'honneur in French, so that we don't have to say it in English. And then there is the assessment of the assessment by the other students, who all looked at each other and laughed. It was probably a very good political sense of the teacher at the time to not notice and to continue as if nothing had happened, so that actually the social order of the classroom proceeded as if nothing had happened, because to a large extent nothing had happened. They were a very large range of everyday assessments that make no difference, and they're probably the fun ones. Anyway, the relevance of such research is commonsensical in my version of anthropology, and I'm sorry that no one yet has mentioned Jean Lave and Michael Cole, and the question about learning following participation, and thus essentially being inaccessible before you have participation. And then, of course, it's limited by participation. But all this, again, in my world, all this is very clear, but it can be challenged. And I cannot help but use the most recent meeting of the Gordon Commission, which I attended. I presented my paper, and the discussant criticized the work as making overly broad generalizations on the basis of anecdotes. What I just did, of course, is mention 3 such anecdotes. A policeman on the beat 60 years ago, a teacher 40 years ago, 4 students 15 years ago. But of course, I don't accept the critique, because The concern with ongoing assessment of what's just happened is a profound philosophical question that is at the core of the American pragmatist traditions, but which we haven't heard much today, but are extremely powerful. And this is George Mead's version that says, once put it, meaning is not in the gesture of an individual, what I just said, nor in the response, like what you might say in direct response to it, but in the third act, when the two preceding moves are assessed as being this, or that, or something else. You are not in control of the assessments that is being made of whatever it is that you are doing at this moment. For those of you who want to do the history of all this, you probably know that Peirce is the one who formalized much of that in that tradition. And it's an interesting question. He has many writings he has about what he called the dynamic interpretant. Notice at the bottom, I don't know whether that will work, but the significance of, and he uses a conversation, fits very well within the research that I'm concerned with. And in a conversation, it's not whether it's really raining outside or what the husband said, or even what the wife said, but what is going to happen, what difference the assessment will make in the rest of her day. And that has not yet happened at the moment of the conversation. So assessments are everywhere. They are fundamental to all communication as a process in real time. We cannot not live without assessing who is talking, what are they doing, and so on. But one thing that in my type of social science is important and rarely mentioned is that the focus of this kind of framework is not on the past, where the answers come archaeologically. If you were Foucault, or in your early childhood, in Freud, or any versions of it, it's not in the past. It's not even in the present. That is, how does the answer make sense given its context structurally? Which is most of my work, most of anthropological work is how does it make sense in this setting for this person? The focus is on the future. What does the answer triggers, among whom, how long, and for how long? So what does all of this have to do with assessment? I have two things from John Dewey, first about the public school, and one statement by a politician about NCLB, because again, all this is political, not simply policy. Now, you know that what happened next, and Mislevy Chatterjee talked about logical model. I'm not sure that this is logical. In my world, this might be arbitrary or play, but from NCLB and Race to the Top, somebody produces something like that, which produces something like that. That is what teachers in New York City received last year. And I don't know whether it means anything to you, to anybody, and so on. The teachers were, principals tried to write whether it's above average, below average, and so on, so the numbers were being numbered again, and so on and so forth. The important thing here is that this here had impact, not simply on how the teacher was going to teach, but on his life as a person, as a union representative, as a husband, as a father. All of that was discussed in all these settings and assessed differently as it proceeded. So, can we really come to the final assessment of a teacher or student? That is it a problem, simply a matter of psychometrics and theories of learning? Or because the assessment is only a statement within further assessment. So, as you may know, this is what happens next. And if you look at on Google images for teachers protesting, it's everywhere. This is not simply stakeholders. This is a political movement, which of course leads political people with a problem. What are we going to do about these people? And times one can put one's foot in one's mouth very nicely by racing, gendering, and classing the reaction to all this. Apparently, Annie Duncan rewrote all this, resaid all this, so it's not raced, gendered, or classed. But essentially, this is the political process, the assessment of the assessment of the assessment, including the assessments by the politicians of what is going on. And of course, there are many politicians of all sorts, and so on. So as I say, I'm very skeptical about searches that are purely, that seem to hope for a technical final assessment. So what are we going to do if there is no, in a sense, philosophical, social, scientific ground to think that we would reach final assessments that would not be political statements within the local lives of people and, of course, their national lives also. I'm not here to give answers, but since that metaphor came up, I think maybe we may not quite need the baby Thorndike gave birth to. Thank you.
It's now my privilege to introduce Dr. Edmund W. Gordon, who will be offering the concluding remarks. Edmund W. Gordon is the John M. Musser Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Yale University. He's also the Richard March Ho Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and Director Emeritus of the Institute for Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College. Dr. Gordon's distinguished 65-year career spans professional practice, scholarly life as a minister, clinical and counseling psychologist, research scientist, author, editor, and professor. He has held appointments at several of the nation's leading universities, including Howard, Yeshiva, Columbia, City University of New York, and Yale. Additionally, Professor Gordon has served as visiting professor at Harvard University. From July 2000 until August 2001, he was Vice President for Academic Affairs and Interim Dean of Faculty at Teachers College, Columbia University. The title of Dr. Gordon's talk and response is A Visionary Perspective on Assessment for Education, born of the Gordon Commission on the Future of Assessment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gordon.
Looking at the history of these ideas and notions and activities, looking at my colleagues and my effort at looking at the history and looking forward, and then astutely recognizing Herve's point that these things don't happen in a vacuum, they happen in a society. And because we have not gotten it right and are not likely to even the next time, some folk are telling us about it. So that this afternoon, if you can spend the day with us, we'll have a session in which we talk about what's happening out there with the people who are the clients that Bob Mislevy reminds us that the profession is guided by. Very early in the life of the commission, well, I'll back up a second. One of the strategies we used in the commission was the convening of a group of what we call consultative conversations. We invited a few consultants, and seldom more than 5 at the time, sometimes only 1. And we spent several hours consulting with them. But one of the things we were told early on was that the ideas that we were asking advice concerning were not really new to most psychometricians, that most psychometricians would even agree with them and would welcome the opportunity to deal with them. But the field is driven by the market. And if we really wanted to make a difference, we had to get out and convince policymakers, practitioners, and even the victims of these instruments of assessment that other things are possible. So what we set out to do in the Gordon Commission was to try to, I think, my friend, the former Dean Kent, suggested that we were doing the intellectual work that's got to be done in this area, we set out to do that intellectual work. And a large part of our effort went into the development of some 30 knowledge analysis, knowledge synthesis papers. The papers themselves are not available in the lounge. The report is, but the link to them is there. We will probably get them published in book form soon, but it is a trove of just valuable intelligence. Some of the best thinkers in the country have helped us think about a variety of issues that came before the commission, so most of which we didn't resolve, we simply identified. And I'll end my remarks today in calling a few of those to your attention. But what we were really about was trying to start a national conversation concerning the relationship between assessment, teaching, and learning. We advanced the notion that pedagogy consists of these three, and if they are appropriately articulated, we can improve what we do in pedagogy. If there was any point of consensus among these 30 or so folk who were my colleagues on the commission, it was probably around the notion that it is time for assessment to place its emphasis on informing teaching and learning. We begin our report with a beautiful, an exquisite history of the movement written by the historian Carl Kasel. And it's a history of assessment of education. And we suggest early on in that report that what the commission is about is trying to move from that history of assessment of to a future history of the assessment for education. The paper that Cliff Hill would have presented today was a small piece of the piece that he did for the commission. The larger paper, he calls it Assessment in the Service of Education, and Assessment in the Service of Education. Cliff can't be with us today, he's ill. He wanted me to emphasize another section of the paper, which I will not, but the abstract is out here for you. He was trying to use assessment in literacy as an example of what he was talking about. But basically, he was suggesting that assessment is a critical feature of pedagogy instead of its being a judge of, instead of its focus on the generation of data by which we judge what we do. Assessment can serve the function of informing what we do. In the release of our report out at UCLA last spring, Luis Gomez, who was a member of the commission, made a very interesting observation in his remarks. He said that the commission was visionary. He said if you go to those papers and to the report looking for a blueprint, you won't find it. He preferred to think of what we were about as serving the function of the North Star. You know, it's the thing you shoot for. If in the next year, I hope it won't take another 125 years, but if in the next year, Teachers College and the other institutions around the country where we scholars hang out can begin the kind of discussions about this relationship between assessment, teaching, and learning that the Commission is advocating for, I will be pleased. I don't think in the near future that vision is going to be materialized. That is, we're not going to have perfect tests, just as we will not have perfect pedagogy. It's really a kind of moving target. But the origins of what we do in assessment may be advisory for us. The people who started this were scientists who saw their function as inquiring into things, trying to understand things, trying to generate better knowledge about things. If we in assessment can keep that as our view, not relegating to ourselves the responsibility for finding truth or making definitive statements about the statuses of people, but rather about better understanding how it is people develop and how they learn, and what humane folk who want to intervene ought to be doing. That's the North Star that Lewis was talking about. That's where we're headed. Now let me briefly call your attention to 2 or 3 of the kinds of issues that consume the attention of the Commission. The first one is almost already commented on. It's a movement for measurement, a movement from the measurement of the status of developed ability, a movement from a focus on the status of human abilities to their appraisal, their documentation, their analysis, for the purpose of not positioning or classifying or selecting or even predicting, but for the purpose of intervening. We worried about the decontextualization of our assessment probes in a period when the epistemology is convincing us that to understand human performance, to understand human behavior, to understand almost any phenomenon, when one takes it out of the context in which it is functioning, it's hard to understand it. Bill McGuire, who's written 2 beautiful little essays on contextualism and perspectivism, reminds us that the human brain is limited in its capacity to deal with phenomena. So we do try to take out pieces of it. In the empiricist tradition, we try to control the things that influence the variations in phenomena. McGuire would say that in the process of doing that, we distort the thing that we are studying. We distort the thing that we are assessing. And the assessment product, then, is a distorted interpretation and a distorted even inference about the thing that we would understand. Now, in the Commission's work, I've got it in my list of items here. I'll simply jump to it, even though I can't find it in my notes. We debated the appropriateness of the tradition of sampling upon which so much of assessment is based. Population sampling is not as serious as the sampling of the instances of behavior by which we make judgments. Because as you draw those samples based upon already distorted and contracted notions of what it is you're looking for, what we end up with is so far removed from the thing that we might consider to be important, and that is the functioning of this individual, that it becomes, in my view, almost immoral for us to make pedagogical or administrative or budgetary decisions based upon those kinds of data. But they are what we've got, and they are the product of the history we've reviewed so insightfully today. The measurement sciences have become kind of the Mercedes, I guess, if you want to use automobiles. It's become the excellent model for the behavioral sciences until the cognitive scientists came along they kind of enjoyed a special position in psychology because we were so precise, we were so scientific, we did such rigorous work. But the gains that we have made in the measurement of developability, and they are enormous. Lots of things have been made possible in our society by advanced psychometric science. But it may be blinding us to what education needs from measurement. I, as a teacher, don't need a lot of help in understanding who's not learning in my class or who has not learned. But what I desperately needed was help in reaching the folk who didn't learn. If you go back to a little essay that Benet wrote, I guess it was the turn of the 20th century, he said those of us who have discovered techniques for identifying the people who are going to have trouble learning or who don't deserve it because they're underdeveloped mentally. If we've achieved that, don't we have some responsibility for doing something about it? So that this tradition in the measurement of developed abilities, very useful for the society, but it will be less and less useful for the world that Kent was describing in his map, where the task of education is not going to be to best predict who can benefit. The task of education is going to be how to universally develop intellective competence in a very, very, very diverse population of peoples around the world. The challenge to those of us who claim expertise in assessment is going to be to produce the kind of information, the kind of knowledge, the kind of even interpretation of what's happening with those people that enables us to develop talent, not simply to identify it. So thank you much for giving time and attention to this work. There's lots to talk about and read our reports, and thank you, colleagues, very much.
I had a question for Dr. Mislevy. You made reference to the APR courses, and I had been reading some articles on, the gap between minority groups and AP or gifted. And I just wanted a clarification. AP was equitable to gifted and talent program? Gifted and talented programs?
Oh, no.
Oh.
Anybody can do it.
How is there some type of testing in order to allow you to get into these courses in high schools or?
No. It's actually true that virtually anybody in the world who wanted to participate in that program can do it. It's also true that most of the students who do it are doing it through their high school. There is nothing that the AP program itself requires for participation. It is certainly possible that some schools have their own rules about who can participate and who don't. But one thing I'll tell you from the experience that I had is that rules for who's gifted and talented and so on, like that, really don't have a lot to do with what you're going to be able to accomplish in studio art.
Thank you.
There was a question in the... Please find the mic and join the conversation. There was a question in the earlier session about the need for annual testing. One of the things that we encountered with the commission is the variety of efforts at embedding assessment exercises, assessment processes in instruction itself. Down at ETS, Randy Bennett, who's one of our commissioners, a project that's called Seaball, I think it is. Dr. Chatterjee has a program she calls proximal assessment. My colleague Eleanor Thomas and I have one we call dynamic assessment. But these are efforts at integrating into the teaching and learning transactions assessment probes. In a little essay I wrote a year or so ago, I suggested that we might look forward to the time when we don't test kids at all, but we psychometricians go to the rich histories of these transactions and distill from it the kind of assessment data we need if accountability or outcome or summative judgments are the thing we need to make. Did someone?
Yeah, there's a question in the back. Yes.
I'm sorry, this question is also for Dr. Mislevy. I've noticed that you gave a list of research scientists and a long list of, I couldn't remember if they were collaborators or clientele or, I just couldn't help noticing, as for some reason I expected to see educators and teachers added to that list. I just wondered the extent of their involvement.
It really depends a lot on what project it is. Like the Cisco Networking Academy, that was very closely connected with the people who actually work with the kids in the schools. So putting that program together, including what eventually went into the simulations and so on, I would say that there were equal parts of experts in networking and people who were teachers of networking in schools. And then smaller parts were people like systems designers building the simulators, psychometricians, cognitive psychologists. And our job was really bring to bear expertise that we had in the service of the nature of learning that had to take place. So I think that any project in assessment that isn't spending some time talking with people connected with students who are actually learning is going to find out pretty fast that they had better do that.
Okay, thank you. So we have one question up here, and then we'll go back to the mics.
So this question is for Jim and anybody else. How confident are you that the consortia, Smarter Balanced and PARC, will incorporate some of the principles that we talked about, using embedded assessments, for example, and then summarizing them at some later point to get the standardized scores? How is that going to happen, or are we daydreaming about these consortia?
I let you two off the hook since I think both of you are consultants.
Not me.
Oh, you're not? Okay, then.
No, I knew enough to stay away from that.
Okay.
and I didn't know enough to stay away from it. Yeah. I think, Susan, it's a really good question. And I think if you look at what the intent was for the design of what actually was intended to be a larger system that included what you might call the large-scale summative accountability test. There were components that would involve interim assessment and formative assessment. The reality is that the development effort, which I think Madhi sort of posed it earlier today. She said it's too fast a timeline. We all knew this was too fast a timeline when this first came about. So the result is it's been driven very much by meeting the set of objectives of producing a reasonable large-scale assessment that can be implemented in 2015. The consequence of that has been less attention, less resources, has gone to the side of this which would be more in support of teaching practice, assessment that would support teaching and learning, and there'll be far fewer resources for that. I think there's question as to the adequacy of that. And so we've got, again, a system out of balance. You've got a system which is, admirably trying to take the Common Core and translate it into advances in assessment. It is not going to be anywhere near what people might have envisioned as the next generation of assessment. It will be steps in that direction. There will be flaws in it because, as was pointed out earlier today, if you think about the timeline, the reality is this. They've been working on item development. There's been some pilot testing, but big field tests occur this spring nationally in both consortia. Millions of students in each consortia are going to be responding to items. All of that information has to be assembled. It has to be looked at from a measurement perspective, and then you have to build operational tests to be used a year later. I see Bob Brennan there, and he from the person who understands testing programs, this is not exactly what you don't want to do on that quick a timeline. It's too fast, and so it's not going to be, I think, what people had wanted. I think the other downside of this is that they have not had the time and the resources to put into the other side of the equation, the support of teachers, the support of teaching and learning, building formative tools and assessments. A lot of work is happening towards that now. Smarter Balance claims they're going to have some of that next year. Park is not even claiming that for next year. They're claiming it for after the spring of 2015. So I think the jury is still out. We will have spent a fair bit of money, and my concern is that the public will sort of say, well, we spent $350 million. What did we get for that? Or some will say, well, we spent $350 million. We solved the problem. This is it. Okay, rather than we are on a path to the kinds of assessment systems we need and the kinds of tools we need, and we have to do a lot of validation and other work. And that was one of the reasons why in the Gordon Commission we sort of worked on a policy statement that tried to make clear that what Park and Smarter Balanced are doing, and DLM and the NICSIC Consortia and others, is not the end. It is a step on the path, and we need to be thinking still about that future.
Okay. So we have a question here, one here, and then one in the middle there. Okay.
My question is also about portfolio assessment, and my understanding is that it's not a brand new idea. There's some schools here in New York City that have been doing it for many years. So since portfolio assessment seems to address many of the concerns people have about testing as it is now, what's preventing education from using portfolio assessment more widely? Is it financial? Is it political? Is it scientific? And this is for any member of the panel, not just doctors.
Yeah, that probably the biggest thing is time. There's sort of this tradition that's built up over 100 years that you can do assessment and you can do it in an hour or two, and it ought to cost about $10. AP Studio Art portfolios as an assessment only would be pretty disappointing because a kid might spend like 350 hours in the class, building all that works and getting feedback. So they structured it so that you can, in fact, get cross-class and common framework and useful information for colleges. But if that's all you did, you wouldn't be very happy. That works because, well, for two things, really. One is that it helps structure meaningful classes that can be adapted locally. I mean, what happens in an AP Studio Art portfolio class in Lawrence High School is really different than it happens in, say, the high school down the street from here. Different media, different students, different challenges, but it's a framework that adapts. The other thing that makes it work is that if you don't like it, you don't have to do it. And so there are plenty of schools who say, you know, this isn't what we want for our art program. We're not going to do it. In every school where there is one, individual students say, I got better ways to spend 350 hours than go and do that stuff. So that's real important too. There's a common framework, and it's not because it's, I mean, the psychometrics and the portfolio requirements don't make that happen. That evolved as an interaction out of people who wanted something like that to happen.
I just want to add one comment about not portfolios, but going back to the PARC and Smarter Balanced, and Bob said it nicely, we're used to, testing kids at $10 a head. The PARC and Smarter Balanced are going to be a bit more expensive, and the expense comes from the performance tasks. The investment in collecting some significant evidence of students actually engaging in some richer types of performances in mathematics, in English language arts. And they will tell you that right now, despite all the claims that were made ahead of time that we were going to do that with artificial intelligence scoring and all of that, which many of us believed was not going to happen in the time frame they had, that 70% of the additional cost has to do with now hand scoring. And so this is I think when you cram all of this into a certain set of design constraints and other constraints like time and money, you find you drive out certain kinds of activities, and it's not about the psychometrics, it's about other design factors and constraints for which then the evidence you get limits the kinds of sophistication of the inferences that you can draw and the measurement models you can apply.
Okay. If I could add on to that, which also addresses a question from this morning too about is every year often enough? In a lot of assessment, if you want to assess learning, every couple minutes is about the right frequency to do it. But you don't do that with the same assessment for everybody at a given point at the same time. The PARC and Smarter Balance, the notion that here is the assessment and it kind of drops in out of the sky puts a very low ceiling on how much you can learn about individuals because it's not contextualizing information. The really big progress out of technology is not going to come out of doing mass testing more efficiently or better. It's going to come out of better matching the evidence that you get to where the kid is, what they're learning now, to focus the evidence that is there for the purpose at hand in that local situation.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll take these. These will be our last three questions. We'll start here, one in the middle, and we'll end over here.
Thank you for putting this on. It's been very interesting. My question's for Dr. Gordon. Your idea and concept of assessment for education, how do you see that going into the policy development with the teacher accountability movement and the use of assessments for teacher evaluations?
I understand you're asking the relationship between these new visions of assessment and teacher evaluation?
Correct.
I'm not sure that I would want to couple those, because as long as the assessment, the focus of assessment is on what kids learn and are able to demonstrate, my view of the relationship between what happens in the learner and the quality of teaching, until we come to a truly customized approach to instruction, I'm not sure that that's a good theoretical model. I once used to like the fairly cliche-ish statement that if learning hasn't occurred, you can assume not much teaching has occurred. But I've seen some excellent teachers who have missed some students, so that I would much prefer, if we were going to be evaluating teachers, to evaluate what they do rather than what their students do with what they do.
Thank you.
I have a question to Professor Pellegrino, based on what you just said. If the assessment, the new balance and everything, is not ready yet, why to go and implement it and not to wait until we solve it and do it well, without mistakes and without regrets? Because that's something I don't get. And then another thing that, if you can comment, all the committee, all the speakers, if you can speak a little bit. Sure. I was asking, given Dr. Pellegrino's comment about the fact that in his response to President Foreman's question, that the new assessment, the balanced or the fancy title, is not ready yet. And the question is why to go ahead and implement it if it's not ready yet? Why not just to make sure that we are all on the same page and we know if it's working or not? And my second question is actually for the commission part, is how much the public or the teaching profession was involved in your work. I'm really fascinated because, Pellegrino, you made a comment earlier about the public will really worried about, oh, we spent $350 million. Did we ask the public if they want all this assessment ahead of time? I have a feeling that we didn't. And the last PDK survey showed that actually most of the public is rejecting all this assessment and testing. So I'm really interested in these issues.
Well, your question is exactly the same kind of question many of us ask. And I think the way to frame it is that both assessment consortia and also the work of the DLM consortium and the NICSIC consortia for students with the 1% population, they're working very hard to develop, you might sort of say, reasonable assessments that do need to be tested. They need to be put in place because we need to actually collect evidence as to their validity, their properties, et cetera. It's not, and so like any assessment program that has to go through a process of implementation and learning from it. The dilemma is not so much that, but that the scores on that will be used very quickly in an accountability system where it was mentioned earlier today, if you have the Common Core and you start to put the Common Core in place, you need systems of curriculum and instruction, and if assessments are tied to that, then you need to have students' opportunity to learn and teachers' opportunity to teach before you hold them accountable for scores on the tests, as well as trying to figure out the sensitivity of those instruments. The policy community essentially continues to want assessment results used in a particular way. You're now seeing pushback, which is to try to sort of say, yes, implement the assessments, but hold the system harmless while we figure out the properties of these instruments, the quality of the assessments, and while the system begins to adapt in ways that are sensible. Don't abandon it, throw out, in this case, the new baby, but be more judicious about what you do with it and how you look at it, because it's going to need to be improved. It's going to need to get better, and we need some time and space, as do the public and educators, to adapt to that, because it's a different world in terms of assessment. So I think there's this sort of strange sort of clash between making progress but doing it on a scale where at the same time it becomes an instrument of policy. And that's where you run into the problems. It's not, in this case, it's not about science. It's about politics. It's about policy. And a fascination, quite frankly, in the United States with the use of large-scale testing as ways to answer policy questions and drive that down into, quote now, a sense that that's going to improve our educational system. Arguments are made quite frequently. In other countries, nobody uses test-based accountability the way we use test-based accountability.
Jim, I should really leave this one to you. You know more about it than I. But there is another perspective. Although before I spoke, I thought, Herve, were you trying to jump in?
Possibly, but
Well,
I think
I'll try to make my point quickly, and then you can do yours. I was on the discussion about 6 months ago with some people who take a conspiratorial approach to what's happening. Mm-hmm. They think that there may be a connection between the privatization of public education and the heavy emphasis on a punitive use of standardized tests. if we can demonstrate that public schools don't work, we can let the private sector take it over. And given the amount of money that is represented by education and the education enterprise in this country, there is a lot of money to play with. And in a capitalist society where there's a lot of money, we know how to siphon profit from it. So these people would argue that we rush to implement an imperfect system, and it's even more imperfect than we've talked about. I think that we are using an old model when much newer models of assessment are available to us, but they are not going to be represented in this $300 million investment because of the time, because of the, I think, limited conceptualization of what we're doing. So one of the reasons for rushing is to demonstrate that it can't work.
So thanks for your patience. I'd like to let Herve respond, and then we'll get the last question. Or did you want to respond, Herve?
Why don't you ask the question?
Okay.
Okay. My name is Jim Perper, and I teach here at Teachers College. I'm in the Applied Linguistics and the TESOL program, and I teach language assessment and testing. And so you can guess that I'm going to be asking you a question about language. Mm-hmm. My first question, I have two questions actually, and since I know from discourse that you'll probably answer the second question first, so let me ask you the question. The first question relates to, the question's for Jim Pellegrino, and the idea that when we think of the demographics right now in the United States, I don't think of native speakers. I think of a lot of second language and English language learners. That's a huge population. And I also know that if I were to ask any of you right now to do your talk in a foreign language, that you might not sound quite as brilliant as you did today. So when we give people these assessments, when we give English language learners assessments, I'm wondering about the role of their first language, which for English language learners, and to what extent this is even a part of the discussion or the theoretical models that are driving cognitions and assessment instruments, and what role that might play. So that's my first question. The second question relates to changing the conversation. If you look at the panel this morning and you look at this panel this afternoon, there's been a lot of discussion throughout about assessments that relate to those that are external to the classroom. At the same time, there seems to be a call for assessments that connect learning with pedagogy, learning and pedagogy. So how can we, when you think of assessments right now that are external to the classroom, a lot of the standardized assessments, they're really looking at learning outcomes. Mm-hmm. They're not really focused on assessment-oriented outcomes. In other words, assessments that are learning-oriented. In other words, to what extent can these assessments not only give us information about learning outcomes, but also give us information about how people learn and the types of assistance they might need during the learning. Mm-hmm. And so those are the external assessments. But internally, in the classroom, you see all of this stuff. You see assistance in all different types of learning-oriented assistance. You see teachers drawing on their competencies and trying to even understand what's happening through assessments. Assessment happens through the entire class. And how can we shift the conversation and the research money to look at some of these internal assessments that are internal to the classroom, so that we can then understand better how to do assessment that is learning-oriented outside of the classroom. That was very long. I apologize for that, but those are two questions.
I'll try to give a short, I'll go ahead, Herve.
Well, I mean, the second question, which the first one, I don't know. Je pourrais le dire en français, mais ça serait très inutile.
Si vous voulez le faire en français, ça va. Moi, je le comprends bien.
But not in Spanish or Mandarin Chinese. So the point of the second question is precisely there is ongoing assessments that doesn't take 5 years and pre-test, post-test, and all this incredible machinery that Thorndike started, and which I think now weighs that whole field beyond anything, because there's no way it's going to happen in real time. In real time, a teacher, when he sees the kids for the first time at the beginning of a year, he will assess right away within 5 minutes. Now, we know that there's biases that are going to be there, but you cannot prevent the teacher, you cannot tell the teacher, wait for 3 months before I can get the results of the assessments of 6 months ago, and then I will get all these numbers over all these variables, whatever it is they are, and I look at those tables, those things, and I have no idea what they mean. When the teacher that I mentioned, I know very well, is my son, he receives all this, he says, what am I supposed to do with these numbers? And that, of course, was 5 years after a year. So the question here would be, if we want to still continue with our still business, there's a political will that we want to know what this teacher at this moment knows and how much he has shifted from yesterday, right? Which in some sort of way, politically, morally, ethically, etc., I don't think it's absolutely necessary that we should know how each person is moving according to whatever it is. But however, there's a political will for this. Could there be, and we talked a little bit about this, unobtrusive assessments, which is more or less what you were calling for and so on. That is, don't simply watch the kid. Collect, don't even do a portfolio. Collect everything the kid has done over the past 5 minutes, and do more or less what one of the two Thorndikes did with the comic book study. You don't have to ask the kid you don't have to create a test. The kid has actually produced something, and now we do actually have the tools, computing and so on and so forth, by which we might be able to do that. Google searches. What does the kid search on Google? And is there an evolution in the searches that the kid is doing on Google from the beginning of the year to the end of the year? That would be...
Jimmy closes out.
Many of the visions that we've talked about are ones that really want to shift us away from what is the drop-in from the sky model we use. And there are political issues associated with that. And you actually used something, you said that where the research dollars going to the large-scale test, quite frankly, it's not research dollars that are going. Where the research dollars are going is actually to doing exactly what you said, is focusing on things that are much more proximal to instruction, that are much more useful for teachers, that allow us to begin to abstract that information in ways that are beneficial to instruction. But the research dollars are small in comparison to the dollars that are spent on an annual basis for the large-scale test. So don't confuse the dollars that are invested in large-scale assessment as research dollars. That's actually money that's going towards sort of the practical thing of building those assessments. Shifting the balance, actually, some of us wrote about this a long time ago. I use a quick metaphor because technology begins to move us in this direction. We have an audit model, which is the drop-in from the sky test. In the retail industry for a long time, they would shut down the store once or twice a year because they would do an audit. They would do an inventory. Now, with the advent of barcodes, all that information is accessible and can be aggregated on different time scales. So if you're a retailer, you know exactly what products are moving, you know how frequently it is, and you can slice and dice that at different time scales for different purposes, depending upon what you want to know. Now, we're not saying barcode kids, but we are saying there are ways in which we can extract information about what's happening that might actually be much more valid, more relevant. But until such time as we can prove to the policy and the public that those measures are more valid, more reliable, and more useful, we are never going to get rid of the drop-in from the sky test, because we have to have something that we can convince people will substitute for that.
All right. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel.